I've always hated driving at night. There's something about the emptiness of the roads, the way the headlights carve tunnels through the darkness, that makes me feel exposed, vulnerable. But last Thursday, I didn't have a choice. My sister had gone into labor early, and I needed to get to the hospital 2 towns over. The route was simple. Just follow the highway for 40 miles. I left the house at 10:30 p.m., figuring I'd arrive by 11:15 at the latest. Traffic was light, and the weather was clear, though the air had that thick, humid weight that comes before a storm. For the first 20 minutes, everything was normal. I had the radio on low, a classic rock station playing softly enough to keep me alert without distracting me. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 10:52. I was making good time. That was the last thing I remember before everything went sideways. When I came to, the car was parked on the shoulder of the highway. The engine was off, the keys still in the ignition. The clock on the dashboard read 12:03 a.m. Over an hour had passed, but I had no memory of stopping, no memory of even pulling over. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone. There was no signal. The road around me was completely empty. No cars, no lights. Just the faint glow of the moon breaking through the clouds. I thought about calling someone, but without service, it was pointless. Instead, I started the car and pulled back onto the highway, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hospital was another 15 miles away. I tried to focus on the road, telling myself I must have dozed off or spaced out, but my gut told me otherwise. My chest was tight, my palms slick with sweat. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. When I finally reached the hospital, it was almost 12:30. My parents were waiting in the lobby, their faces tight with worry. Before I could explain what had happened, my dad pulled me aside. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice low. "We've been trying to reach you for hours," I showed him my phone. "Still stuck on no service," he frowned, holding up his own. "You didn't answer any of our calls. It didn't even ring. Just went straight to voicemail. I didn't know what to say. It didn't make sense. I should have been there over an hour ago." My dad shook his head, muttering something about traffic or construction, but I could tell he didn't believe me. That night I tried to forget about it. My sister had a healthy baby boy, and I told myself that was all that mattered. But the next morning, when I went out to the parking lot to leave, I noticed something strange. The car was spotless, too clean. I live in a rural area, and it's impossible to drive at night without your windshield getting smeared with bugs. But there wasn't a single speck of dirt on the glass. Not on the hood, not on the tires. It was like the car hadn't been driven at all. I brushed it off as a coincidence, but the unease lingered. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things that didn't add up. My gas tank, for one. I should have needed to fill up after the drive to the hospital and back, but the needle hadn't budged. My wallet was another issue. I always keep it in the center console when I drive, but now it was in the glove compartment. I don't remember moving it. The worst discovery came 3 days later. I'd been avoiding the car, opting to work from home, but eventually I had to go out for groceries. When I opened the trunk, I found a long scratch running across the inside panel, like something sharp had been dragged along the metal. I hadn't put anything in the trunk recently, and I couldn't imagine how it had gotten there. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the drive over and over and over in my head, trying to piece together what had happened during that missing hour. Around midnight, I decided to check the car again, hoping maybe I'd find something I'd overlooked. This time I noticed the smell. Faint but unmistakable, like wet earth and rotting leaves. It was strongest near the back of the car. I popped the trunk again, shining a flashlight along the edges. At first I didn't see anything unusual, but when I looked closer, I saw something wedged into the crevice where the trunk meets the frame. It was a small tuft of fur, coarse and dark, stuck to the metal like it had been caught in the latch. My stomach turned as I pulled it free, the smell growing stronger. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I wrapped it in a paper towel and hid it in the garage. Since then, I haven't driven the car. I haven't even touched it. I've been walking to the store, borrowing my mom's old sedan when I need to go farther. But every night when I lie awake in bed, I hear the faint hum of the engine in my mind, growing louder and louder, until I'm certain it's parked right outside my window. I don't know what happened that night, but I'm terrified to find out. I've always been good at keeping track of my schedule. I'm one of those people who lives by the clock. Early riser, meal prepper, everything planned to the minute. That's why the hour I lost last Wednesday has been eating away at me. It started like any other morning. My alarm went off at 6:30 a.m. sharp. I hit snooze once, then got up, made coffee, and went for my usual jog around the neighborhood. It was a crisp morning, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional car passing by. When I got back home, my smartwatch said 7:15. Perfect timing. After a quick shower, I sat at the kitchen table with my breakfast. Oatmeal, as always, and scrolled through my emails. My next meeting wasn't until 9, so I figured I'd spend the next hour prepping. But when I glanced at the clock above the stove, it wasn't 7:30 like I expected. It was 8:45. At first I thought the clock was broken, but my phone and watch both confirmed it. Somehow, over an hour had vanished. I tried retracing my steps. Maybe I'd zoned out or gotten distracted, but the gap didn't make sense. I was awake, alert, going about my routine like normal. I hadn't even finished my oatmeal. I brushed it off as a fluke. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention. But then it happened again that afternoon. I was on a conference call that started at 1 p.m. I remember checking the time midway through. It was 1:45. The call ended early, and I decided to take a short walk before my next meeting. The walk couldn't have been more than 10 minutes, but when I got back, the clock read 3:15. That time I felt it, the heaviness in my legs like I'd been running for miles. My chest hurt, not sharp pain, just this dull, tight pressure. I stood in the kitchen staring at the clock, trying to piece it together, but no matter how hard I concentrated, there was nothing, just blankness. The next few days were uneventful. No lost hours, no strange sensations. I even started to convince myself it was stress. Too much work, not enough sleep. That was until last night. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, like a low hum or a soft buzz, but it grew louder, almost like static from an old TV. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was going to pass out. Then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of my living room. The static was gone, replaced by silence so heavy it made my ears ring. My first thought was to check the time. My phone was on the couch, screen glowing with the lock screen. It was 3:33 a.m. I should have gone to bed. I should have convinced myself it was another fluke and moved on. But something made me check the front door instead. It was unlocked, just slightly ajar, the chain swinging lightly as if it had just been moved. I don't remember opening it. I don't even remember walking to the living room. But when I stepped outside, the streetlights were flickering, casting long shadows across the empty street. I swear I saw something moving down by the corner, just at the edge of the light. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too thin. But the moment I blinked, it was gone. I locked the door and stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting on the couch with my phone in my hand. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop staring at the clock. This morning I noticed something strange on my smartwatch. There's a step count for last night. 4,673 steps logged between 2 and 3:30 a.m. I don't know where I went. I don't know what I did. But I'm scared the next time it happens, I won't come back at all. There was I never used to lock my bedroom door. Growing up in a quiet town, the thought of needing extra security inside my own house seemed paranoid. My parents raised me to believe the world was safe if you stayed within your lane. That changed the night I woke up standing in my backyard, barefoot and freezing, with no memory of how I got there. It started earlier that evening. I came home from my part-time job at the diner, exhausted and sticky with the smell of frying oil clinging to my clothes. My routine was predictable. Shower, dinner, and then mindless scrolling until I fell asleep. That night was no different, or so I thought. The last thing I remembered was lying on my bed, phone in hand, checking updates on a group chat. I didn't feel tired, but the next thing I knew, I was standing in the dew-soaked grass behind the house, my toes stung from the cold. I wasn't dressed, just wearing the tank top and shorts I had slept in. The house was silent when I went back inside, but something about the stillness felt wrong. I checked the front door. It was still locked. All the windows were shut. My parents' room was dark, their breathing heavy from behind their closed door. Everything looked as it should, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. When I returned to my room, I noticed my bed was neatly made. That sent a shiver through me. I hadn't made my bed in years. The phone I'd fallen asleep holding was on my desk, plugged into the charger. I certainly hadn't done that either. The next morning I tried to brush it off as sleepwalking. Maybe I was more exhausted than I realized. But then it happened again, a week later. This time I woke up sitting in the passenger seat of my mom's car, parked in the garage. The car keys were on the dashboard, and the garage door was shut tight. I wasn't cold like before, but I was disoriented and nauseous. My hands felt sticky, and when I turned them over, I saw faint smudges of something dark under my nails. Dirt. Back in my room, nothing seemed out of place. My bed was made again, my phone plugged in just like before. But on my desk was a crumpled piece of paper I didn't recognize. It was blank except for a faint smear of ink, like someone had pressed down hard with a pen before changing their mind. That was when I decided to start locking my bedroom door. I didn't tell anyone about what had been happening. Not my parents, not my friends. I didn't want to admit how much it scared me, how I started to question my own sense of time and reality. The lock worked for a while. 3 weeks passed without incident. I convinced myself it was just stress, that I was creating problems where none existed. But last night proved me wrong. I woke up in the woods. The air was damp. The smell of moss and decaying leaves thick in my throat. My legs ached, like I'd been running for miles. My hands were scratched and there was blood. Just a little, on the edge of my shirt. It wasn't mine. I could feel the soreness of a bruise forming along my ribs, though I didn't remember falling. I had no idea how far I'd wandered, but the faint glow of streetlights guided me back to the road. When I reached my house, everything was the way I'd left it. The lock on my bedroom door was intact. My parents were still asleep. But there was one change I couldn't explain. On my desk was a Polaroid picture. It showed the woods where I'd woken up. In the center of the photo was a dark figure, blurry and distant, but clearly there. I don't own a camera. This morning I told my parents I'd be spending a few nights at a friend's house. It's a lie, of course. I'm sleeping in my car far from the house, but I'm not sure it matters. Wherever I go, I can't help but wonder if I'll wake up somewhere else. Somewhere worse. There was It started on a cold November evening. I was working late at the diner, the kind of small-town place that always smelled like burnt coffee and hash browns. My shift ended at midnight, and since my car was in the shop, I had to walk home. It wasn't a long walk, usually 20 minutes at most. But that night, something went wrong. The streets were empty as I left the diner, the faint hum of streetlights my only company. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as a biting wind swept through the town. I kept my head down, focusing on the familiar route past the gas station, across the bridge, then 2 blocks to my apartment. The first sign that something was off came when I crossed the bridge. Normally, it overlooked a quiet creek that wound its way through the town, but that night the water was gone. The creek bed was completely dry, its rocks glinting faintly in the moonlight. I stopped for a moment, staring down at it. I told myself it was just the season, that maybe the water had been diverted or dried up temporarily, but something about the emptiness felt wrong, like I was looking at a place that had been abandoned long before I arrived. I kept walking, my pace quickening. The gas station should have been visible by then, its neon sign glowing faintly in the distance, but the street stretched on, the darkness deepening with every step. I glanced at my phone to check the time. 12:15 a.m., still on schedule, but when I tried to open the map app, the screen froze. The GPS couldn't locate me. I brushed it off as bad service and stuffed the phone back in my pocket. After another 10 minutes of walking, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavier, the wind quieter. I turned to look behind me, expecting to see the bridge in the distance, but the road was empty. It was as if the bridge had disappeared the moment I crossed it. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to keep going. The gas station had to be close. That's when I saw the man. He was standing in the middle of the road, his back to me. He wore a long coat and his shoulders were hunched against the cold. I called out, asking if he was okay, but he didn't respond. I called again, louder this time, and he turned slowly to face me. Even now, I struggle to describe what I saw. His face was off. Not deformed or monstrous, just wrong, like it didn't belong to him. His features were too smooth, too perfect, and his eyes seemed to reflect the dim light in a way that made my stomach churn. He raised a hand, pointing down the road, and then he was gone. I blinked, my breath hitching in my chest. One moment he was there, and the next the road was empty again. I told myself I must have imagined it, that I was just tired from a long shift. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. I didn't want to keep walking, but I didn't have much of a choice. Turning back seemed just as pointless as moving forward, so I started walking again, my steps quick and unsteady. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, each step feeling like I was moving farther from where I was supposed to be. When I finally saw a building in the distance, relief washed over me. It wasn't the gas station, but it was something. A small diner with a glowing open 24-hour sign in the window. I'd never seen it before, but the sight of it felt like salvation. I pushed open the door, the little bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the diner was empty except for a single waitress standing behind the counter. She looked up as I entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. I told her I'd gotten lost and asked if she knew how far I was from my apartment. She didn't answer right away, just stared at me like I was speaking a language she didn't understand. Finally, she said that I should sit down and rest for a bit, that I looked tired. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, and it put me on edge. I asked again how far I was from home, and she just repeated that I should sit. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 2:57 a.m. My stomach dropped. Somehow more than 2 hours had passed, but I couldn't remember walking that long. It felt like I'd only been on the road for 30 minutes, maybe 40. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but the screen was still frozen at 12:15 a.m. I didn't sit. Something about the place felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be there. I mumbled a quick thank you and backed out the door, ignoring the waitress's protests. As soon as I stepped outside, the air felt colder, heavier. The diner behind me was gone, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. I started running. I didn't know where I was or how far I was from home, but I didn't care. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop until I saw the familiar outline of my apartment building in the distance. When I stumbled through the door, I collapsed on the couch, shaking. My phone screen flickered back to life, the time reading 4:03 a.m. I had left the diner at midnight, a walk that should have taken 20 minutes at most. 4 hours had passed, but I couldn't account for where I'd been or what had happened. The next day, I retraced my steps, determined to figure out what had gone wrong. The bridge was there, the creek flowing as usual. The gas station was exactly where it should have been, its neon sign glowing faintly in the daylight. But there was no diner. The empty lot was there, just like I'd seen, but it looked as if nothing had stood there for years. I don't walk home anymore. I take the bus, even if it means waiting an extra hour after my shift. I don't know what happened that night or where I went, but I know one thing: the man in the coat, the diner, the endless road. They weren't supposed to exist. And somehow for 4 hours I wasn't supposed to exist either. There was something.